The Jack the Ripper case is officially closed. That is not clickbait, that is a scientific fact.
Two British scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helped solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
After 137 years, new DNA evidence has confirmed his identity. We are going to reveal the name, the science, and the story right now. But what nobody tells you is how this man, a known and violent individual, was allowed to roam free when police knew who he was. The evidence does not just point to a suspect, it points to a man the police were watching. The truth is not just who he was, it is why they let him get away with it. Biology versus the perfect crime. For over a century, the legend of Jack the Ripper was just that, a legend. A ghost story made of fog, gaslight, and shadows. He was the unsolvable phantom, the predator who baffled Scotland Yard and vanished into history. Hundreds of suspects, zero proof. Everyone is obsessed with the idea that he had to be someone special, a brilliant surgeon with a dark secret, a mad artist, even a member of the royal family. But here is the catch. The evidence that finally unmasked him was not a complex conspiracy. It was a piece of fabric allegedly found at the scene of the Ripper's fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, on September 30th, 1888. This shawl was passed down through the family of a policeman who was at the scene. For decades, it was just a morbid curiosity. Most experts dismissed it as a fake. Just one more piece of Ripper memorabilia in a market flooded with them. So, here is the deal. In 2007, an author and amateur sleuth named Russell Edwards bought it at an auction. He was convinced it was the real deal. He staked his money and his reputation on one final desperate gamble. He wanted to use technology the Victorian police could not even dream of. Edwards tracked down Dr. Jari Louhelainen. He is a world-renowned expert in genetic analysis from old, degraded samples at Liverpool John Moores University. This was not like a fresh TV crime show investigation. This was a piece of silk that was over 125 years old at the time of the test. It was contaminated by countless hands, by time, and by the elements. Getting anything from it was considered a miracle. Dr. Louhelainen and his team got to work in a sterile lab. They focused on the dark stains. Using advanced techniques, they carefully extracted the microscopic genetic material left behind. They were looking for something called mitochondrial DNA. What most people do not realize is that this type of DNA is a genetic time traveler. Unlike regular DNA, which is a mix from both parents, you only get mitochondrial DNA from your mother. She got it from her mother, and so on. It is passed down in an unbroken female line for thousands of years. It is tough. It lasts a long time, and it is the perfect tool for cracking a historical case. The first test was simple. Was the shawl even real? The team tracked down a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister. They took a sample and compared it to the DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl. It was a perfect match. The shawl was real. It had been at the scene, soaked in the victim's blood. That alone was a massive discovery. But then they found something else. Mixed in with the victim's DNA were other trace samples, specifically samples consistent with fluid from a male. This was it. This was the perpetrator's genetic signature left behind in his moment of horrific rage. Now came the final step. Edwards and the team had a prime suspect, a man whose name was already whispered in the original police files. They tracked down a living female line descendant of that suspect's sister. They got a sample. They ran the test. Again, it was a match. After 137 years, the science pointed with 100% certainty to one man. And it is not who you think. It was not a prince. It was not a doctor. The fabric held the secret for over a century. But before we get to the name, we have to talk about the crazy theories this science finally put to bed. Because for over 100 years, people have been losing their minds over who this guy was. Why we love the crazy lies. Before we lock in on the real guy, we have to look at the madness. The gaps in the police files left room for the wildest stories you can imagine. And the biggest one? The royal conspiracy. Everyone loves this one. It feels like a movie. The theory goes that Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, was the Ripper. People said he went mad from syphilis, or that he had a secret child with a shopgirl in Whitechapel, and the royal family sent hitmen to silence the women who knew about it. It sounds amazing. It has everything: royalty, scandal, secret societies like the Freemasons. There are even books and movies claiming the Queen's physician, Sir William Gull, rode around in a carriage slaying women to protect the prince. But here is the catch: it is complete fiction. Official records show the prince was not even in London during the murders. He was in Scotland for some of them and York for others. Basically, he had an alibi. But the story was too good to die. Then there is the mad artist theory. Walter Sickert was a famous painter who was obsessed with the Ripper case. He painted scenes that looked suspiciously like the crime scenes. Some people claimed he put hidden clues in his art, confessing to the crimes. They said he was impotent and hated women. A famous crime novelist even spent millions of dollars trying to prove Sickert was the guy, buying his paintings and cutting them up to look for DNA. But guess what? The DNA on the stamps of Sickert's letters did not match the Ripper letters, and most of the Ripper letters were fakes anyway. Sickert was just a creepy guy who liked dark stories, not a serial slayer. And get this, some people think the Ripper was actually an American. You might have heard of H.H. Holmes, the guy who built the murder castle in Chicago. He was a con man and a monster who killed dozens of people in his hotel during the World's Fair. A descendant of Holmes recently claimed that Holmes escaped to London during the Ripper time frame and did the crimes there. They even compared handwriting. It is a terrifying thought. Two of history's worst monsters being the same person. But the timelines do not really add up. Holmes was busy running scams in the U.S. It is a wild theory, but it falls apart when you look at the travel logs. There was even a theory about a woman. Jill the Ripper. People thought maybe a midwife was doing it. A midwife would have blood on her clothes and no one would ask questions. She would have the anatomical knowledge. It explains why the victims, who were women, might have let the killer get close without screaming. A female killer in Victorian London? That would have been the ultimate disguise. But the violence was so brutal and physical, most experts agree it had to be a man with significant strength. What most people do not realize is that these theories exist because we want the Ripper to be a supervillain. We want him to be a genius or a prince. It makes the horror feel meaningful. But the truth? The truth is usually much uglier and much sadder. The DNA brings us back to Earth. It tells us the killer was not a prince in a carriage. He was a poor, mentally ill immigrant living in the dirt, just like his victims. The face of a monster. His name was Aaron Kosminski. The name Aaron Kosminski means nothing to most people. It is not a name that sells books or inspires blockbuster movies, and that is exactly the point. The wow factor here is not that the Ripper was a glamorous celebrity. The wow factor is that he was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the very heart of Whitechapel. He was not a phantom. He was a local, and the police knew exactly who he was. Kosminski had fled Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, to escape brutal violence against Jewish communities. He arrived in London with his family in the early 1880s, settling in the East End. By all accounts, he was a deeply troubled man. He was known to be mentally unwell. Modern experts believe he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He was plagued by dark visions, auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that told him to do things, and a profound, violent hatred of women. This is not just speculation. This is what the police at the time believed. While the public and the newspapers were going insane over fake letters and theories about mad doctors, the top cops on the case were quietly building their own shortlist. And Kosminski's name was at the very top. Chief Constable Melville McNagden wrote a famous internal memo in 1894. He named Kosminski as a primary suspect. He described him as a man who had a strong homicidal tendency and was averse to women. McNagden noted that Kosminski had been detained by police after threatening his sister with a knife. This was a guy who was already acting out violently. But here is the catch. The most chilling evidence comes from a private note. It is called the Swanson Marginalia. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was the man who oversaw the entire investigation. He was on the ground every single day, reading every report. Years later, after he retired, he got a copy of his boss's memoirs, a book by Robert Anderson. In the margin of the book, right next to the section about the case where Anderson mentions a suspect, Swanson scribbled a private note in pencil. He wrote that the perpetrator was Kosminski. He wrote that this was the man who was sent to an asylum and perished there. This is history-changing. The officer in charge privately confirmed the identity. Swanson even detailed a secret identification. He claimed a witness, another Jewish man, had identified Kosminski as the killer but refused to testify against him in court because he did not want to have a fellow Jew executed. It was a dead end for the police legally, but morally they knew they had their man. And get this, Kosminski lived right in the middle of the slaying locations. The geography is terrifyingly accurate. The crimes happened in a tight cluster around his home in Greenfield Street. He knew the alleys. He knew the shortcuts. He knew where the shadows were deepest. And then in 1891, his family finally had him committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. He was losing his mind completely. He stayed in asylums for the rest of his life until he died in 1919. And when did the Whitechapel slaying stop? Exactly when Aaron Kosminski was taken off the streets. The timeline is perfect. The DNA matches. The police suspected him. The geography fits. It all points to one terrified and violent man. He was the monster. But to understand the monster, you have to understand the nightmare world that made him. The streets of London were not safe for anyone. The perfect place to hide. To understand the terror, you have to understand the world that hid him. The London of 1888 was not the charming city of top hats and carriages you see in movies, and that is putting it lightly. It was a tale of two cities. While the rich lived in grand houses in the West End, enjoying parties and electric lights, the East End, especially Whitechapel, was a living nightmare. It was one of the most crowded, diseased, and desperate places on earth. Over 900,000 people were crammed into a few square miles. It was a tangled mess of narrow, unlit streets, dark alleys, and hidden courtyards. We are talking about population densities of over 1,000 people per acre. Imagine a rock concert crowd, but they live there, cook there, and sleep there. The sanitation was non-existent. Sewage ran in the streets. The smell was unbearable. The air itself was toxic. A thick yellow fog, known as a pea souper, choked the city. It was a mix of river mist from the Thames and black coal smoke from thousands of chimneys. This fog was so dense you sometimes could not see your own hand in front of your face. It tasted like metal. It stung your eyes. It was the perfect cover for a predator. You could walk 10 feet behind someone and they would never know you were there. There was no safety net here. Poverty was not just an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. If you did not have money for food, you starved. If you did not have money for a bed, you slept outside. The heart of this world was the lodging house or doss house. These were filthy, horrible places where you could rent a bed for a few pennies a night. These were not hotels. They were packed rooms, smelling of unwashed bodies and gin. Some offered a 4-penny coffin. This was literally a wooden box shaped like a coffin to sleep in. It was supposed to be safer than the floor. Others just had a rope strung across the room for men to lean on as they slept standing up. In the morning, the landlord would cut the rope and everyone would wake up hitting the floor. For the women who became the victims, life was a constant daily struggle to find those pennies. They were unfortunates, women who had fallen through the cracks of society. They were not glamorous. They were middle-aged, poor, and desperate women. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were alcoholics trying to numb the pain of their lives. They had lost husbands, children, and homes. They had to walk the streets late at night in the fog and the dark. They were looking for any way to earn the price of their bed. 4 pennies. That was the cost of life. 4 pennies. They would do anything for it. This is what made them so vulnerable. They were looking for customers in the dark. They would approach a man in the shadows. "Will you go with me?" they would ask. What most people do not realize is that this environment did not just hide the monster. It helped him. The police were completely overwhelmed. They had no radios, they had no forensic science. Their main tools were a whistle, a lantern, and a wooden truncheon. In the maze of Whitechapel, a man could commit a terrible act and vanish into the fog in less than a minute. The predator did not need to be a genius. He just needed to be local. He needed to know the escape routes. He needed to know which alleys had no lights. And he needed to know who to pick. The women were so desperate they would trust a stranger for a moment, and so poor that no one would notice they were gone until it was far too late. The police were fighting a losing battle against the darkness itself, and the media was about to make it 1,000 times worse. Why the police failed. When a criminal became a legend, the London Metropolitan Police launched one of the biggest manhunts in history. They flooded Whitechapel with officers. They drafted in extra men from all over London. They interviewed over 2,000 people. They detained and questioned at least 80 men. They house-to-house searched entire neighborhoods. So why did they fail? Yeah, about that. They were not just fighting a man. They were fighting the time they lived in. First, there was no such thing as forensic science. The concept of a secure crime scene was brand new. When a victim was found, crowds would rush in to look. It was entertainment for them. Reporters would trample over evidence, moving bodies to get better sketches. The scene would be contaminated in minutes. Police had no fingerprinting. That would not be used for another decade or so. They had no blood typing. If a suspect had blood on his shirt, he could just say he worked at a butcher shop, and the police could not prove otherwise. All they had were witness reports from people in dark, foggy streets. And these witnesses were unreliable. Some said he looked shabby like a sailor. Others said he looked respectable like a gentleman. Some said he was tall. Some said short. It was useless. It was like trying to catch a ghost. What is truly wild is that they did find clues, but they did not know what to do with them. Near the scene of Catherine Eddowes, they found a piece of her bloody apron. It was soaked in blood and feces. The killer had used it to wipe his knife. He dropped it in a doorway on Goulston Street. This proved he was heading back towards the East End, towards where Kosminski lived. On the wall above the apron, someone had written a message in chalk. It read, "The U's are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The spelling was weird, Juwes. Was it a clue from the perpetrator? Was Kosminski, who was Jewish, trying to frame his own people? Or was he trying to say the Jews were being blamed unfairly? Or was it just random graffiti in a neighborhood full of racial tension? We will never know. The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, arrived at the scene. He was terrified. Anti-Semitism was rising in London. People were already blaming the Jewish immigrants for the crimes. Warren worried that if the public saw that writing, it would start full-blown riots. He ordered it erased immediately. They washed away one of the only pieces of physical evidence they ever found before a photographer could even arrive. They destroyed the clue to save the piece. But here is the crazy part: the letters. The predator became a global celebrity when the infamous Dear Boss letter arrived at a news agency. It was written in red ink. It taunted the police. "I love my work and want to start again," it said, and it was signed with the chilling name Jack the Ripper. That name changed everything. Before that, he was just the Whitechapel murderer. Now he was a brand. The problem? Almost all experts now agree it was a fake. It was likely written by a journalist named Tom Bulling at the Star newspaper. He wanted to sell more papers, so he invented a supervillain. And it worked. It created a media frenzy. The police were drowning in thousands of copycat letters from people pretending to be the Ripper. They were wasting time chasing ghosts while the real killer was sleeping in his bed. However, one letter might have been real. The From Hell letter. It was sent to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of citizens trying to catch the killer. The letter was messy, full of spelling errors. It did not use the name Jack the Ripper, and it arrived with a small cardboard box. Inside was half of a preserved human kidney. The letter claimed it was from one of the victims. "I fried and ate the other half. It was very nice," the writer said. And get this. Catherine Eddowes, the victim found with the shawl, had her kidney removed by the slayer. Doctors examined the kidney in the box. It was human. It was from a woman. It showed signs of Bright's disease, which Eddowes had. While the public was obsessed with fake letters, the real predator was mocking them with biological proof. The police were chasing shadows while the real man, Aaron Kosminski, was slipping through the cracks of a broken system. The case went cold. The files were locked away, but the evidence remained waiting for the future to unlock it. A 100% match. So how did we get from a dusty box to a name? It starts with the shawl. It is a long piece of silk patterned with flowers. It looks expensive. It was too nice for a woman like Catherine Eddowes to own. She was pawning her boots for gin money. She would not have a silk shawl. The theory is that the killer brought it. Maybe as a lure. Look at this nice shawl. Come with me. Or maybe he just had it on him. When the police found Eddowes' body in Mitre Square, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson was there. He saw the shawl. He asked his superiors if he could take it. In those days, police often took souvenirs from crime scenes. It sounds crazy now, but it happened. He wanted to give it to his wife. Can you imagine? "Honey, I brought you a gift from a murder scene." His wife obviously was horrified. She never wore it. She put it in a box. And that is where it stayed. And then there is the psychological profile. FBI profilers who have looked at the Ripper case say Kosminski fits the bill perfectly. They say the Ripper was likely a disorganized killer, someone who acted on impulse, out of rage. He mutilated the bodies in a chaotic way. This fits a man suffering from severe schizophrenia, hearing voices, acting out delusions. It does not fit the cool, calculated surgeon or the posh prince profile. The mad doctor theory relies on the idea that the cuts were surgical, but modern pathologists say the cuts were rough, jagged. They were. Because it was never washed, it became a time capsule. The blood, the grime, the DNA, it was all locked in the fibers. It passed down through generations until Russell Edwards bought it. He gave it to Dr. Luhalainen. The doctor used a technique called vacuuming. He used a special vacuum with a filter to pull microparticles out of the fabric without destroying it. They found two types of stains. One was blood, the other was consistent with semen. This was the breakthrough. They needed to compare the DNA. For the blood, they found a woman named Karen Miller, a direct descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister. They swabbed her mouth. They compared it to the blood on the shawl. Match. The shawl was definitely at the scene. Then came the hard part. The semen. They needed a relative of Aaron Kosminski. This was harder. Kosminski died in an asylum with no children. They had to trace his sister's line. They found a woman who wished to remain anonymous. They got her DNA. They compared it to the semen stains. The type of DNA they used, mitochondrial DNA, is not like a fingerprint that is unique to one person. It is shared by everyone in a maternal line, so it proves the DNA came from someone in Kosminski's maternal line, but combined with the fact that Kosminski was a known suspect living in the area, the probability of it being anyone else is almost zero. Dr. Luhalainen calculated the odds. The specific genetic mutation they found is rare. It appears in only a tiny fraction of the population. To have that specific rare DNA on a shawl found at a Ripper crime scene and to have it match the police's top suspect, that is not a coincidence. That is a smoking gun. The truth is boring. So that is it, right? Case closed. The DNA from the shawl points to Aaron Kosminski. It fits. But it is not that simple. This is where you have to decide for yourself. The moment the DNA findings were published, critics came out swinging. Their biggest argument is one word: contamination. They argue that the shawl is too old. They say that too many people have touched it over the last 137 years. The policeman, his wife, their descendants, the auction house people, Russell Edwards himself. They claim the DNA could have come from anyone who handled the shawl. Maybe a descendant of Kosminski touched it at a Ripper convention? It sounds like a stretch, but in science you have to rule everything out. Others argue about the shawl's provenance. How do we know for sure it was at the scene? The police inventory list from 1888 does not explicitly list a silk shawl. It lists a piece of old skirt and other rags. Did the policeman really take it? Or is it just a family legend that got out of hand? But Dr. Luhalainen stands by his work. He argues that the specific cells they found were embedded deep in the fabric weave, protected from casual contact. You cannot just brush against a shawl and leave semen cells deep inside the fibers. That requires fluid contact, and the match is rare. Not done by a surgeon. They were done by someone with a knife and a lot of anger. Kosminski fits. He was poor, he was local, he was mentally ill, and he hated women. The truth is often boring. We want a movie villain. We want a grand conspiracy. We do not want to hear that the most famous monster in history was just a sad, sick man who needed help but got none. It removes the glamour. Jack the Ripper was not a supernatural force. He was a human failure. A failure of society to treat mental illness. A failure of the police to protect the poor. A failure of a city that let people live in squalor. The shawl brings us as close as we will ever get to staring him in the face. We might never have a signed confession. We might never know his inner thoughts. But we have the science. And for the first time in history, we have a name that is backed by biology. The Phantom has been pulled out of the fog. Why do we still care? Why are we talking about this 137 years later? There have been worse killers since then. Killers with higher body counts. But Jack the Ripper is different. He was the first modern celebrity killer. He was the first one to grow up in the age of the newspaper. The press created him. They gave him a name. They gave him a logo. They turned a tragedy into a product. And in doing so, they forgot the victims. For over a century, Mary, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane became just props in a horror movie. They were the Ripper's victims. We forgot they were mothers, daughters, sisters. We forgot they were real people struggling to survive in a harsh world. So, do you think the DNA evidence is final? Or is there still a chance the real Jack the Ripper got away? Are you Team Kosminski, or do you still believe in the royal conspiracy? It is a debate that might never truly end. If you want more mysteries solved by science, hit that like button and subscribe. We will see you in the next one.